Okay, good morning. My name is Isabella Perry, and I'm going to be your moderator for this webinar. We appreciate you joining us. This presentation will be about the common pitfalls in aerospace certification presented by Kim Wagner, PJR's Aerospace Program Manager. So some quick housekeeping. There will be a Q&A at the end of this webinar. So if you have any questions for our presenter, please just use the Q&A portion of the Teams control panel. The slides and the recording will be available on our website after this presentation. And any additional questions, please contact us through our website for any information you might need. Now, Kim will take it away discussing today's topic.
Thank you, Isabella. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. As Isabella mentioned, we're going to be talking about some commonly misunderstood aerospace requirements in the 9100, 9110, and 9120 standards. All right, so Isabella already introduced me, but as she said, I'm the Aerospace Program Manager at PJR. I'm also a certified Aerospace Auditor for 9100, 9110, 9120, and I've been with PJR for over 10 years now. I've also listed my email address here. Please feel free to take note of it, and you can always reach out if you have any questions, something maybe you don't think of by the end of their presentation, or just anything about aerospace certification in general. All right, so there are several requirements in the standards that some organizations seem to struggle with more than others. So whether you're new to the aerospace standards or you've been certified for a while, maintaining your quality management system for a while, we think that an in-depth review of some of these requirements and the misconceptions surrounding them will be helpful. So today we're going to be tackling the following topics. We're going to start with value-added process measures or key performance indicators, KPIs, and some of the misconceptions surrounding those. We're going to touch on supplier performance monitoring and the requirements for that. We're going to talk about organizational risk versus operational risk and the difference between these two. And we're going to finish up talking about the control of nonconforming outputs process requirements and the corrective action process requirements. Sometimes those two get a bit confused, so we'll clarify that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. Now, I know this is a lot of text on your screen right now. I just wanted to get the requirement in front of you so you have some context for what we're talking about. So we're going to start with the value-added process measures in AS 9100, 9110, and 9120 and what's required. So this stems from the requirement in 441C and G specifically. And as it says here, the organization shall determine the processes needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization, and shall C, determine and apply criteria and methods, including monitoring, measurements, and related performance indicators needed to ensure the effective operation and control of these processes, and G, evaluate these processes and implement changes needed to ensure that these processes achieve their intended results. So to summarize, we know that you have to define the process of your quality management system. And once you have those defined, you need to determine what criteria and methods you're going to use to measure the effectiveness of those processes. How are you going to know if those processes are operating effectively? And how are you going to be able to tell when they're not, when you need to take action? So just as an example, when we talk through this section here, I've put together this brief little interaction of processes. So our example management system that we're going to be talking about, they've got 4 processes. They've got management and support, and their operational processes include contract review, purchasing, and manufacturing. So that's sort of just the example we're going to keep in our minds as we go through this section here. So per this requirement, these requirements of the standard, we need to apply some sort of measures of effectiveness to these processes. Now, I'm going to bring up a document here that I'm going to refer to a few times throughout this presentation. So the International Aerospace Quality Group, the IAQG, which is the body that publishes these standards, they also maintain a clarifications document on the 9100 2016 series standards. So it compiles a bunch of different questions and answers regarding these specific clauses. It's a really useful resource to have on hand. I've included a link to it here, which you'll be able to use once we send out the slides. It's available on the IAQG website, but it really is a great resource to have if you're unsure of the intent of any clauses. I mean, it almost touches on almost all the clauses of the standard. There's quite a lot of questions and answers there, but they did weigh in specifically on these clauses that we're talking about now, 441C and G. So let's take a look at that clarification. Okay, so the question that was posed asks, is it the intent of the standard that an organization can just have a top level requirement that is used to evaluate the effectiveness of the QMS and several individual processes without those processes having a specific metrics? So for example, on-time delivery of product to the customer of 98% is the top level metric, and the metric used to evaluate the effectiveness of the purchasing process, the contract review process, and the manufacturing process with no additional metrics. So if they've met on-time delivery of 90%, then all processes are deemed effective. So in this example, this organization is asking, can we just use on-time delivery as the one metric that measures all of our processes? Is that sufficient? Does that meet the intent of the standard? And the answer to this is no. The IAQG said that the 9100 series standard requires the organization to determine if the identified processes are effective in achieving the planned results. Each process measure should evaluate the effectiveness of that process and be value added. So that's really important here. The process measure needs to measure that process specifically and add value when you're measuring it, right? It says further that this is the measure that would be included in the process effectiveness assessment report, the PAIR, which is what you'll see in your OASIS audit reports for your operational processes. And this measure is the key performance indicator for that process in the PAIR. It does say the 9100 series standard doesn't mandate a certain number of process measures. And it does also clarify here in that second paragraph that smaller organizations typically have fewer measures than larger organizations. And that's because these small organizations have increased visibility regarding their process health due to their size. But regardless, this does not alleviate the need for determining if processes are effective and achieving planned results. And organizations can have additional working level measures that may not flow up to top management or management review. So, to summarize, it is not appropriate to just have a single top level measure that measures all of your processes. Now, it's not to say that, your specific process measures, your specific KPIs flow up into a top level objective, but it's not appropriate to only use the top level objective to measure all your processes. Again, I want to reiterate this point. Each process measure should evaluate the effectiveness of that process and be value added. If we have something that is more specific to measuring the effectiveness of the specific activities in a process, it gives you a better idea of how that process is really performing, right? We want these process measures to be meaningful to you. So let's get into some examples of some more appropriate KPIs or process measures. Okay, and I'm gonna bring up another really great resource that's available to you for free. So the IAQG also has an online resource called the Supply Chain Management Handbook, or SCMH. This is free to access. You just have to register. It's developed by subject matter experts to assist organizations with understanding requirements and how to apply them. It's a really great resource. They're constantly adding to it with new sections, new chapters. A lot of them are tied to the standard. I mean, there's a whole section on design with different chapters regarding the different aspects of design. There's, chapters on first article inspection. There's a lot of great information there. So I really recommend checking that out. But I'm going to specifically be talking about SCMH section 7.11.2, which gives a lot of examples of some value added key performance indicators that you can apply to your processes. So I'm going to talk about some of those examples. Okay, so again, we're kind of using that example interaction of processes for our example quality management system, where our three operational processes are contract review, purchasing, and manufacturing. So we're going to start with some KPI examples that could help measure your contract review process. So for example, we've got quote turnaround time. This would measure the amount of RFQs or requests for quotes that are answered and in a defined time frame versus the total number of RFQs received. Order entry errors would, measure how many orders are entered with errors versus how many orders were entered overall. Quarterly sales, if you have a quarterly sales goal, did you meet that goal? Sales conversion rate, the number of contracts awarded versus the total number of contracts bid. Adherence to program gates. So let's say there's different program milestones for a contract. Are you passing those on time? So these are, again, they're more keyed into the specific activities that you would usually see in a contract review process. And so it's really measuring how effective those activities are. Instead of just having that blanket top level objective, it's really zeroing in on the specific activities of the process to see how well those activities are being done. Okay, So purchasing next, we've got some more examples here. So first, we've got purchase order launch performance. So this would measure kind of the number of purchase orders sent on time versus total number of purchase orders. So how effective, how quickly are we issuing purchase orders when a need is identified? Purchase order acknowledgement rate. This would measure the how quickly, or I'm sorry, the number of purchase orders suppliers are acknowledging versus the total number of purchase orders sent. Supply chain performance, just looking overall at how well suppliers are performing in terms of quality and on-time delivery. We're going to talk about that a little bit more a little later. Supplier capacity rating. This would measure the supplier's capacity versus the capacity required by the product or the program. And then receiving inspection acceptance rate. This would measure the total number of incidents in the receiving inspection process. How many rejections were there in receiving inspection? And again, these are all zeroed in on the purchasing activities. Last, we've got some examples for manufacturing. Scrap rate, the number of items scrapped divided by total number of items produced. Item escape rate would internally would be any escapes in the internal processes. First pass yield would be, rating the on-quality deliverables produced by the process, divided by the total number of deliverables going to the process over a time period. Inventory accuracy, how accurate is our inventory counts versus the actual count, what's actually on the floor versus what's recorded in our database. Labor efficiency, the ratio of the amount of time planned for completing certain activities versus the actual time it takes. And then on-time manufacturing, again, more specific than on-time delivery. We're looking at, how many items are completed in a given time period versus how much time was planned for them to be completed. So overall, we're seeing in these examples some really specific KPIs that are zeroed in on the activities of those processes. And if we're establishing some really strong value-added process measures, it will allow your organization to have a higher level of visibility on the health of your process. I mean, tracking on-time delivery overall, you have to do it. You're required to do it. But if you're only tracking on-time delivery, you're maybe missing some, other measures that could really give you a better idea of the health of those processes. And then if you do miss a KPI target, you can really zero in on the specific cause of that underperformance and take corrective action. And that would lead to continual improvement of each process and in turn of your QMS overall. Okay, so the next topic we're going to jump into is supplier performance monitoring in AS 9100. This one we've had a lot of questions about over the years. And so the requirement we're going to be talking about specifically is in 8411C. It says the organization shall periodically review external provider performance, including process, product, and service conformity and on-time delivery performance. So it says here, you've got to review external provider performance, supplier performance periodically. You need to review their quality and their on-time delivery performance. And so it sounds simple, but there's actually a lot of questions about this clause. So, the questions are, which suppliers do we need to review, right? It just says external provider performance. It doesn't say which suppliers and how often. Those have been a lot of questions we've gotten over the years. So let's, again, return to that clarifications document because there is a specific question regarding this. So it says, if the organization wishes to apply a risk management approach to suppliers, indicating varying levels of rigor for evaluation, approval, and reevaluation, dependent upon the effect on product conformity, is that acceptable? So this organization is asking, basically, is it okay for us to, evaluate suppliers differently? Maybe we apply a different level of rigor for a certain group of suppliers and others, depending upon risk. And the answer says, and again, this is all from the IAQG, Clause 8411C requires a periodic review of external provider performance, including conformity and on-time delivery. So it is required that every supplier that affects product process and service conformity have a periodic review of this information. So there it is. All suppliers have to undergo a periodic review of this information if they affect product and process and service conformity. The organization can review this information at various frequencies depending upon risk, but the information is still required to be reviewed. And they continue here, without a periodic review of quality on-time delivery, how would an organization apply a risk management approach? So to summarize that, you are required to periodically review all suppliers that affect your product or service conformity. That has to be done. But in terms of how often, that is up to you as an organization. You can have varying frequencies for different supplier tiers. So let's say you've got, your top 10 suppliers that make up 90% of the, products and services that you purchase. Maybe you want to review those suppliers' performance every 6 months, where the other suppliers you review every 2 years. That would be acceptable. But again, it's up to you. As long as you are at some point periodically reviewing all suppliers that affect product and service quality, that it would be acceptable. But the important thing is that at least at some point, all of the suppliers that affect product and service quality are being reviewed. All right. The next topic we have here is organizational risk versus operational risk. So in the AS 9100 and 9110 standards, there are two different clauses dedicated to risk management. We have 6.1 and 8.1.1. Now, 9120 has 6.1. It does not have 8.1.1, so I just wanted to mention that. These clauses require your organization to manage different kinds of risks. There are organizational risks, which are addressed in 6.1, and then operational risks, which are addressed in 8.1.1. And sometimes these can be confused with one another. Sometimes we see organizations that are doing a really great job with their operational risk management. They have a really thorough process that's part of their contract review process. They're looking at risks for each job. It's fantastic, but they've forgotten about the organizational risk management portion of 6.1. So we're going to take a closer look at these clauses, and then we're going to look at some examples of different risks that fall into these two different categories. Okay. So, and again, I know this is a lot of text in your screen. I won't read through everything, but this is the 6.1 requirement, right? This is also in ISO 9001. It's all the aerospace standards as well. As it says, when you're planning for the quality management system, the organization shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1. Now, 4.1 is what talks about the context of your organization, considering internal and external issues that may affect your organization, and the requirements referred to in 4.2, which talks about your interested parties of your organization, those parties that could affect your organization or that your organization could affect, and determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. So again, this section is talking about the risks you encounter when planning for your entire quality management system. It's looking at these higher level organizational risks. So here are some of those types of risks, right? So these are just examples. So let's say you have an aging workforce where you've got multiple retirements approaching in the next few years of key personnel. That's a potential internal issue that could be a risk for your organization and could be something that you need to think about and plan for to mitigate. For another example would be cybersecurity risks. And this is unfortunately something that all organizations have to deal with these days. There's phishing and ransomware, malware. That could be an external issue or an internal issue that your organization should possibly mitigate with your risk management process. There are risks associated with extreme weather events. If you live somewhere or if you work somewhere where there's forest fires or hurricanes or earthquakes, these could potentially pose a risk to your organization. They're an external issue that you have to consider when planning for your quality management system. Another example would be maybe there's a competitor opening a facility in the same region. This is an external issue that could potentially affect your QMS, something that you want to manage at a higher level. So let's talk about 8.1.1 next. Again, this is just in AS 9100 and 9110. It is not in AS 9120. This again is a lengthy clause here, but as it says, the organization shall plan, implement, and control a process for managing operational risks to the achievement of applicable requirements, which includes as appropriate to the organization and the products and services. And then it talks about assigning responsibilities for risk management, defining risk assessment criteria, identifying, assessing, and communicating risks throughout operations, identifying, implementing, and managing actions to mitigate risks that exceed the defined risk acceptance criteria, and then acceptance of risks remaining after implementation of mitigating actions. As you can see, this this requirement is a little more prescriptive than 6.1. 6.1 is a little more open-ended, where in 8.1.1, they really want you to define these things very specifically, right? Like clear risk assessment criteria, clear assignment of responsibilities. And as it says here in this note that's underlined, it clarifies right in the standard that while clause 6.1 addresses the risks and opportunities when planning for the quality management system of the organization, the scope of this clause in 8.1.1 is limited to the risks associated to the operational processes needed for the provision of products and services. So clause 8. Okay. So let's look at some examples of some operational risks, right? First, we've got a customer's purchase order identifies a delivery date that will be challenging to meet with the current workload. So you're reviewing a customer's PO, they put a delivery date on there that's going to be really tough for you to meet. That's a potential risk, right, in your operational processes. Will you be able to meet that delivery date? Is there something you can do to mitigate that? Any actions you can take to try to meet that delivery date? Or you need to go back to your customer and have them maybe revise that delivery date, which I know is a lot easier said than done. Next, customer requires the use of a vendor you have previously had issues with. So customer is saying, this is a vendor we want you to use for maybe heat treat, but you've had issues with that vendor in the past. What can you do to mitigate that, right? Is there any actions you can take to try to mitigate that risk of using that vendor? A new customer request for quote for a large component that takes up more facility space than usual. So you're getting a request for a quote. The customer wants a really large component where it's going to take a lot of maneuvering, a lot of moving things around for you to actually fulfill that RFQ, that quote, right? So that would be a potential risk. Maybe you mitigate it. Maybe you just say this is not something that you can quote. A customer contract flows down requirements that your organization has not yet implemented, such as specific requirements for counterfeit parts prevention program or CMMC. So by taking on this contract, you'd have to implement these requirements that are new to your organization. That's a potential risk, right? Lastly, effects of tariffs in certain industries on material costs. This could potentially affect your purchasing process, right? So that's a risk related to the operational processes. So as we've seen, the standard really differentiates between the two different types of risks. There's a risk when planning for your quality management system, those organizational risks that are dealt with at a higher level. And then you have the risks specifically associated with the production processes or the service realization processes. Those are the operational risks. And you can have, kind of similar methodologies for dealing with these types of risks. It's just important that you address them both in some way. There's no specific requirements for, a specific risk management process. We see a lot of organizations that have a SWOT spreadsheet. We're looking at strength, weaknesses, opportunities. We see other types of methods as well. But as long as you have a method in place to address both of them, that would allow you to meet this requirement of the standard. Okay. So the last thing we're going to talk about today are control of non-conforming outputs and corrective action. So in the 9100 2016 series standards, there are now only 2 required procedures. I say now, it's been 10 years that this has been in place. But if you remember previously, in the previous version of the standard, the 2009 version, there were quite a few more requirements of the standard that required procedures. Now, the standard just requires a control of non-conforming outputs procedure and non-conforming corrective action procedure. And I say procedure, it doesn't necessarily have to be a procedure, it just has to be maintained and documented in some way. Now, these processes do, of course, go hand in hand. So it is acceptable to have one single procedure that addresses both, but you have to ensure that that procedure addresses all aspects of 8.7 and 10.2. Sometimes we see organizations that have a really robust control of non-conforming outputs procedure, a really robust process, but they've forgotten to address certain aspects of 10.2. There's specific things that need to be addressed in that clause as well. So we're going to dive in and take a closer look at these clauses and what they require specifically when it comes to documentation. So we're going to start with 8.7. The intent of this clause is to prevent the unintended delivery or use of non-conforming outputs at all stages of production and service provision. There are, of course, different ways to deal with non-conforming outputs. There are different dispositions that are allowed. And then when further action is needed after dealing with a non-conforming situation, that's when the requirements of the corrective action process should be applied and when clause 10.2 steps in. So Here's 8.7 of the AS 9100 standard. I know it is, again, a lot of text on your screen. I really just want to focus in first on the documentation requirements here. So this is what is bolded here. As it says, the organization's nonconformity control process shall be maintained as document information, including the provisions for defining responsibility and authority for the review and disposition of nonconforming outputs, and the process for approving persons making these decisions. So not only does your procedure or other method of document information need to define who is responsible and who is authorized to disposition non-conforming outputs, but you also have to include there the process for approving people to make that decisions. So maybe it's the quality manager that does this, but what's the process for approving that person to be able to make those decisions? That also is a part of it. It also has to include provisions for taking actions necessary to contain the effect of the nonconformity and other processes of products and services. So how do we contain the nonconformity? Timely reporting of nonconformities after delivered products and services to the customer and to relevant interested parties. So if we find a nonconformity that affects a delivered product or service, we have to report that to the customer and other relevant interested parties. And then defining corrective actions for nonconforming products and services detected after delivery. So that's, of course, it's pointing to 10.2 when it gets to that point. If we have something that's detected after delivery. And then 8.7 continues on the next page. I want to first go to 8.7.2, which talks about the records needed for this process. So the organization shall retain document information that describes the nonconformity, describes the actions taken, any concessions obtained, and identifies the authority deciding the action in respect of the nonconformity. Now, before we move on, I just wanted to also talk about this requirement here for product disposition for scrap, because there's, I think, a valuable clarification I also wanted to share about this. So as it says here, if we have a nonconforming product that's dispositioned for scrap, it must be conspicuously and permanently marked or positively controlled until physically rendered unusable. So conspicuously and permanently marked is really important. It's not sufficient to just tag the item, since that's not permanent, right? That tag can be removed. It needs to be something, a permanent marking, a conspicuous and permanent marking, or it needs to be positively controlled. So for example, locked in a cage that only a couple people have access to, a couple authorized people have access to. And that either one of those needs to happen before that product dispositioned as scrap is physically rendered unusable. And I'll return to that in a moment. Okay. So again, we're talking about the documentation that's needed here. First, we have to have a procedure or other means of maintaining document information that defines the provisions for all these things that we just mentioned, right? The procedure has to describe how your organization addresses all of these items. And then when you do run into non-conforming material, non-conforming product, non-conforming outputs, you must keep records of that describe the non-conforming output, the actions taken, any concessions obtained, whether it's from customer or other relevant authorities, and who authorized the action. All of that needs to be included on that record, right? Okay. Before I move on to corrective action, I wanted to share this clarification since I think it's important because it's another thing that I think sometimes confuses organizations. It's talking about scrap in the context of 8.7. So the question is, our organization makes parts from foam, plastics, and fiberglass, and as such, it is impossible to permanently mark the scrap. Scrap is normally the excess material from die cutting, water jet cutting, or routing. We had special bins made that had the scrap/trash on the sides. These bins are emptied into a trash compactor as they fill up. Is putting this type of material in a marked bin adequate, or does each piece require marking? So in this question, the organization is talking about the excess material that occurs during their production processes, and they mark that as scrap. They're asking if that scrap material, the excess material, has to be dealt with in the requirements of 8.7 for product disposition as scrap. So the answer from the IAQG says the intent of this requirement in 8.7 is to ensure no defective product reenters the value stream, which is the purpose of having the requirement to physically render non-conforming product unusable. It is important to remember that 8.7 is for product that does not conform to product requirements. Therefore, if the materials are conforming and there is material excess from die cutting, water jet cutting, or routing operations or other production operations, your excess material does not fall within the scope of scrap control in this clause. If your product is non-conforming to product requirements, that is when scrap provisions of clause 8.7 will be applicable. Once the material is dispositioned as scrap, it would need to be marked or positively controlled until it can be rendered unusable. So they're clarifying here that the excess material that you deem as scrap does not need to follow this requirement. This requirement is only for product that is non-conforming, and it needs to be rendered physically unusable so no one can mistake it for conforming product. So if we're just talking about excess material scrap, that doesn't fall under that because that cannot be mistaken as conforming product. So it's only after you have a product that maybe failed inspection, that then's disposition as scrap, that is the thing that needs to be positively controlled or conspicuously and permanently marked until it is rendered unusable. So I just wanted to share that in case there was any confusion about that as well. Okay, so next let's talk about corrective action. So the intent of this clause is to ensure that your organization manages nonconformities and implements corrective actions appropriately. So when a nonconformity occurs, including those from nonconforming outputs or from complaints, problems arising from external providers or audit results, the organization must take action to investigate what has gone wrong, correct it, and avoid similar issues from recurring. So here's what the requirement in the standard, right? It's again pretty lengthy. And in 10.2.1, it talks about all these different things that the organization has to do when a nonconformity occurs. And then at the bottom here, it says the organization shall maintain document information that defines the nonconformity and corrective action management processes. So all these requirements here have to be addressed by your organization in your corrective action procedure. And then there's, of course, also the requirement for records, right? The organization has to retain document information as evidence of the nature of the nonconformities and any subsequent action taken and the results of any corrective action. And I also wanted to just highlight this requirement here. When determining the causes of the nonconformity, when you're conducting a root cause analysis, it's required to include as applicable those related to human factors. I'll return to that in a moment, but I just wanted to talk about this because that's also something else that there's some misconceptions about that as well. Okay, so in terms of the corrective action process for 10.2, what documentation is required? There has to be a procedure. It has to address all of those items that we saw in 10.2.1. And I say procedure, but it could be other maintained document information. Then you also have to keep records as evidence of the corrective action, right? So that has to include the nature of the nonconformity, what was the nonconforming condition, any subsequent actions taken, which includes your correction action, your containment, root cause analysis, and corrective action. And then it must also include the results of any corrective action. So were the corrective actions effective? Were they ineffective? How did you determine that? Is any additional action needed? Were risks updated? We need to know also the results of the corrective action, not just what the corrective action was. So all of 10.2.1 through H need to be recorded in some way. We typically see that on a corrective action form. Okay. So yes, this is another clarification I wanted to share. This is about okay, this is a really good one. So the question asks, some are interpreting this requirement that we are required to determine causes for every nonconformity we encounter, no matter how insignificant. It refers back to the previous version of the standard, the 2009 version, and says, 9100 2009 allowed us to define requirements on when we would determine causes in our procedure. Realistically, I don't believe that any organization has the resources to determine causes for every nonconformity. So this question is asking, do we need to determine the root cause and initiate corrective action for every single nonconformity we encounter? And here's the answer. It says clause 10.2.1b starts with evaluate the need for action. So the first action when you encounter nonconformity is to evaluate if there's a need for action. If so, then the following actions in clause 10.2.1b would be required, including root cause analysis, corrective action. The organization establishes criteria for when taking corrective actions are appropriate to the effects of the nonconformities encountered. And as it says here, it's not wise to expend significant resources for isolated, low-cost nonconformities. So, to summarize that, when your organization encounters a nonconformity, you must correct it. Then you determine, based on your defined process, if further action is needed. At that point, you would have to follow the requirements of 10.2.1b through H. But as it says here, and again, this is from the IAQG, that you don't have to follow this for every single isolated low-cost nonconformity. It is up to you as an organization to evaluate when you need to follow that process, but does not mean that you have to follow it every single time. So it's really important that within your corrective action procedure, you have some definitions of when you need to follow this process, right? So that you won't be expected to follow it for every single low-cost nonconformity. Okay, one more clarification from the IAQG. This is related to human factors. Anyway, I mentioned that it's in the clause here. This is something that trips up some organizations. It says when you're determining the cause of the nonconformity, include as applicable those related to human factors. So the question here asks, is it acceptable to just list human factor as the cause as stated in this requirement? The answer is no. The intent of adding those related to human factors is to consider human factors in the causal analysis and not stop at human factor or workmanship. So the standard wants you to consider human factors when you're doing your root cause analysis, but you can't stop there. You have to take it further. So, okay, first I wanted to share some examples of human factors because you might not know what I'm talking about. So these are the dirty dozen human factors. I've included a link here to an FAA document that talks about each of these a little bit further. It's great if you need a little more context on how to consider human factors. So when we talk about human factors, these are the types of things that we're talking about. Lack of communication, complacency, lack of knowledge, distractions, lack of teamwork, fatigue, lack of resources, pressure, lack of assertiveness, stress, lack of awareness, norms. These are all different factors that affect us as humans and that could have an influence on us making a mistake, right? So let's say we have an issue where an operator made a mistake. When you got to your root cause analysis, you realize that that operator was distracted. But that doesn't mean that your root cause analysis can just say, operator was distracted, then your corrective action, talk to operator about not being distracted at work. We need that root cause analysis to go a little bit further. So they were distracted, but why? What is going on in their work environment that made that person distracted? What is missing in that process to eliminate distractions? That's where we need you to go with that. Go a little bit further. Maybe they're distracted because there's, I don't know, maybe there's just there's people walking by all the time, right? Maybe you can revert that that pathway to go somewhere else to limit distractions, something like that, right? We want you to go a little bit further. That's maybe a bad example, but the idea is that you don't just stop at the human factor. You explore that a little bit further with some real changes that you can actually make in the process to decrease that human factor or eliminate that human factor and other related causes. Okay. So let's look at the bigger picture here. We're talking about control of non-conforming outputs. We're talking about corrective action. Let's look at an example to really zero in on the differences between the two and how these are documented, right? So in this example, we've got a machinist that accidentally drops a part number 1234, while transporting finished parts to quality control or QC for inspection. QC determines that the part is damaged and no longer conforming. The part is tagged with a red non-conforming tag and placed in a bin for non-conforming parts. QC then fills out a form for the non-conforming part, documenting the issue and authorizing rework to be completed by the machinist to bring the part back into conformance. The specific person who authorized this signs their initials on the form. No concessions were needed. The QC personnel who signed is listed in the control of non-conforming outputs procedure as someone who has been approved to disposition non-conforming parts. So this is an example of that control of non-conforming outputs process in action and in compliance with 8.7. We had a non-conforming product. It was tagged and removed from the production area, brought to QC. QC dispositioned that part. QC is authorized to disposition that part, and a record was completed that documented the nature of the nonconformity, that documented the disposition. There were no concessions needed. It was signed by the person who authorized the disposition, and that person is approved to disposition nonconforming parts. So that's how the 8.7 part of this process works, the control of nonconforming outputs. Now, let's say that this same organization requires that all non-conforming output forms be submitted to the quality manager. The quality manager then reviews the forms to determine if additional action is needed. This quality manager tracks non-conforming outputs to see if there are any trends. And then the quality manager has seized in the last few months, there have been several issues with parts being dropped. They've had several non-conforming output forms submitted to them where the issue is that a part was dropped. Due to this, the quality manager determines that corrective action is necessary and initiates a corrective action form. So, you kind of returning that question of, do we always need to pursue corrective action for every single nonconformity. We don't. But in this situation, the quality manager sees that there's a trend here. We've had multiple issues where the same cause has led to a nonconforming output. So we need to implement a corrective action to address this. Maybe this was the first time that the part was dropped. Maybe it hasn't happened since then. It's just, a one-off. Maybe they don't see the need for corrective action to be initiated. But in this situation, there's a trend here. So this quality manager determined there needs to be corrective action. So on that corrective action form, what do we need to be recorded? Okay, so I've got kind of an example of what we would typically see on a corrective action form. It covers everything that's required in 10.2.1. And I'm also going to talk about the kind of specific sections here as they relate to responding to third-party nonconformances, because we have really stringent requirements that we have to follow when we review corrective action responses. And so I'm going to touch on those as we work through each of these sections. So in this corrective action form, we see a clear statement of nonconformity. It describes what happened. The process for transporting parts to QC for inspection is not currently effective. Our objective evidence says that a machinist dropped part 1, 2, 3, 4 when bringing the part to QC. So we have an overall statement of nonconformity. What is occurring here? What's the deficiency? And the specific situation that led us to determine that this process was not effective. In this situation, containment wasn't needed. The correction says the dropped nonconforming part number 1, 2, 3, 4, was reworked and brought back into conformance. As you can see here, the correction is written in past tense, and it does also reference the specific part number that we're talking about from the objective evidence. So in terms of when we review third-party corrective action responses, correction responses, if the correction said the dropped part will be reworked, that wouldn't be acceptable. It needs to be written in past tense. We need to know that it has already happened, right? And it also has to reference the specific issue that was in the objective evidence. So we've got the specific part number here. It needs to be very clear that that very same issue has been corrected. Then we have the root cause analysis, which says the process of transporting parts by hand is not effective due to the susceptibility of human error. This can be addressed by utilizing carts, but personnel are not currently trained to use carts and carts are not available. This is due to the work instruction not requiring the use of carts. So in this root cause analysis, we're considering human factors, but we're not stopping there, right? The person dropped the part because they're human, because we all make mistakes. Instead, they're thinking of what is missing that could have prevented this. And so they've come up with the idea of using carts to transport parts, right? I know this is a very basic example, but it's just to demonstrate the requirements here. And they don't even stop there. They even go further to say, why are we not using carts? We're not using carts because people aren't trained to, because we don't have them, and because our work instruction doesn't require it. So then the corrective action, it addresses all those parts of the root cause. They purchased carts for the purpose of transporting parts. Applicable employees have undergone training on this new process of transporting parts to QC and back. They've attached training records. They've updated their work instruction to require the use of carts when transporting parts to QC, and they've attached that revised work instruction as well. So as we always want to see that your corrective action addresses all parts of that root cause analysis, right? We also want to see evidence of things happening, right? So ideally, we'd see the training records, the revised work instruction, maybe a PO for the carts or just a picture of the carts. And we'd also want to see evidence of the correction as well, so that non-conforming outputs form would work. And then last but definitely not least is we have a verification of effectiveness. As it said in 10.2, I'm just going to go back to that real quick. You must retain document information as evidence of the results of corrective action. So not only do we need to know what corrective action you've taken, but what were the results of that corrective action? So as it says here, they implemented the cart system on 10.1. On 12.1, 2 months later, they saw that no recurrences of dropped parts had been reported or observed. Interviewed employees reported that the process is effective, corrective action has been verified, and is closed. So we have a very clear statement here of how effective that corrective action was and how they determined that. That's what we want to see when we're talking about the verification of effectiveness. There's also a note here that asks if need to update risks, and it says not needed at that time. Just going to go back to that requirement here, where it says here, update risks and opportunities determined during planning if necessary. That's only if your organization feels that it's necessary to do so. Okay. All right, so the prior slide was an example of the corrective action process in action in compliance intent 2. In this example, we have a non-conforming output that was an input to the corrective action process. Inputs to the corrective action process also come from customer complaints, from audit findings, employee identified problem, external provider issues, and performance data. But to summarize, the control of the non-conforming outputs process and the corrective action process are related. They absolutely are. But it is important that each process is fully realized within your QMS. Both of these sections require a procedure. You can use a single document that addresses both if you'd like, but you have to ensure that all aspects of 8.7 and 10.2 are defined and documented. So if you do have a single document for both, just make sure that, go back to the sections of those standards and make sure that you're addressing all requirements in each of those clauses, both in 8.7 and 10.2. Sometimes we see really great procedures that do a great job of addressing both, but sometimes things are missing. Again, a robust control of non-conforming outputs process and corrective action process will lead to a continually improving and effective aerospace quality management system. Okay, before we finish, I just wanted to include one last note. This is in some ways related. For those of you that are currently certified, I just wanted to bring this up about level 2 data access in OASIS. It was brought to our attention that quite a lot of our clients have turned on this grant access for all users and member companies. So just to back up a bit, when you log into OASIS, if you are the supplier administrator for your organization, you go to manage and audits, and then you go up to level 2 access. This is where you'll get requests from customers or from other bodies that want to see your audit reports. They also would now can see your insights reports as well if they have level 2 data access. But some organizations have turned on this here that grants access for all users and member companies. That means that anyone logged into OASIS could review your audit reports and your insights reports. So I just wanted to give folks a heads up about that. Maybe you're not aware, maybe you are. It's totally up to you if you want everyone to be able to see your reports. But I would just suggest checking this just to make sure if you don't want it on that it's not turned on. Because during our most recent accreditation body audit, the assessor had noticed that quite a lot of our clients had that turned on. So just wanted to bring that up to you just in case you want to check that. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me and I can help you walk through how to get there. Okay, well, that was just about it. Any questions from anyone, anything we covered today? Isabella, are we able to unmute Connie, or is it best that Connie puts her question, types it in?
It would be best to use the Q&A portion of the panel just so we're able to answer it properly.
Okay. So Connie, if you want to go ahead and type your question into the Q&A. All right, Drew Kidder, has a question. How detailed does risk analysis need to be? We are a small organization and it can be a significant amount of effort. Yes, it can be quite a lot to take on. It is ultimately up to you how detailed you want your risk analysis to be. As long as you're addressing those requirements of the standard, it's up to you to develop even your own risk analysis method. I mean, I've seen things that are very simplistic and meet the requirements of the standard, and I've also seen really complex risk management tools as well. So it's up to your organization. You can always shoot me an email if you wanted to kind of show me something that you're working on and wanted a better opinion on it. I could put my email in the chat as well so that everyone has access to that. Oh, it's turned off. But it is kwagner@pjr.com. KWAGNER@pjr.com. Okay, David Everett asks, we will get a copy of the slide deck emailed to us, correct? Isabella, I'm not exactly sure how the slides are distributed, if we just post those somewhere. Can you help with that question?
So the slides and the presentation will be available on the PJR website, pjr.com. It'll be, let me go right here to get the exact way to follow it. If you go into the training bar, click down on training, or not training, I'm so sorry. Yep, go down on the training bar and click webinars, and then you'll see past webinars and past webinar slides. That's how you'll be able to access it. You can also go to our YouTube channel, Perry Johnson Registrars, and the YouTube video will be uploaded of today's presentation.
Thank you. I think I saw another hand. I think it was Courtney Thompson. I think we still didn't hear from, I think it was Connie. So if anyone has a question still, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A section. Or you can, of course, feel free to email it to me later. Isabella just put my email address in there, so you can feel free to email me questions as well. Anyone else have any questions? Okay. Well, it looks like that's it. But again, my email address is right there, so please feel free to take note of it. For those of you that had your hand raised but weren't able to type it in, please feel free to shoot me an email and I can help address any questions you had. Thank you all so much for joining today. I really appreciate it.